is Stephen Walker, and I have reason to believe that I have known my father as long as any of the Walkers here. I was prepared to say that I knew my father as long as anybody here, but these pesky Clausens showed up. and they've actually known him longer than me. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my father from the stories that he shared with me and from the memories of the times that we shared together in my youth. I've spent a great deal of time driving across the country talking to my father on the phone. And quite often I would use those opportunities to ask him about his life in order to better understand him and get him to relate stories to me that he hadn't shared with everybody a million times. Most of you know that my father loved to hunt. His favorite horse also happened to be his father's favorite horse. He was a horse named Shorty, and I believe he was a Morgan. He spent a lot of time riding Shorty while hunting for food that he could bring home to his family. When my dad entered the military service and went through boot camp, his fellow recruits were amazed at how well he could shoot a rifle. Without bragging, he told them that he had a lot of experience as a young man with guns. One of the soldiers asked him how many deer he thought he had shot in his life. And he did some quick calculations in his head and told the others there that he thought it was over 1,000 deer. Immediately, all of the other soldiers thought my father was bragging. But he held to his statement and realized it was truthful, but hard for city boys to believe. He didn't talk about hunting much as he got older. He felt bad about all the deer that he had killed and related to me that he had no lingering desire to hunt in his older life. Although he did go hunting with me once. My father attended electronics school in Red Bank, New Jersey, and finished at the top of his class. His first assignment was the White Sands Proving Grounds, where he was stationed with 2 other electronics school graduates that had also finished at the top of their class. This was after the Korean War, and his superior officer had been tasked with sending 2 of those graduates to Korea. The officer had received a large crate of electronic equipment to be installed in the base, and individually he asked each of the 3 if they thought they could assemble the equipment. My father, who never lacked confidence, responded by asking the officer if the crate had come with any operating manual or instructions. When the officer replied that they had, my father said he knew he could do it. The other graduates were not as resourceful and ended up being transferred to Korea. My father lived up to the confidence he expressed and did such a good job installing the communications equipment that he was later asked by the same officer if he would be willing to re-enlist and follow him to a cushy job in Europe. My father wanted to take him up on the offer. However, my mother, Roxana, was very much against him re-enlisting and having to pack up the kids to move overseas. Instead, he left the service and took a contracting job installing the communication system for the newly constructed Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. My earliest personal memories of my father are from that time in Colorado Springs in the late 1960s. Most of those memories are small snapshots of the life of a 5-year-old. I remember being excited about our first black and white television. I remember bugging Dad about letting me watch Lost in Space, which I thought he would appreciate. However, he said it was too hokey and preferred the Hunkley Brinkley Report. I remember him coming home one day carrying a metal box which helped him study and practice reading and writing the Hebrew language. He liked to take on projects like that and fancied himself good at picking up other languages. I recall sitting in our living room facing him in an easy chair while he quizzed me on the alphabet with flashcards. I remember it being hard, but I also remember him being patient. I have a vivid memory of the time he taught me to ride a bicycle, and that I kept asking him to leave me alone as he ran beside me while I wobbly pedaled forward very dangerously. As I approached the second grade, our family moved to Billings, Montana, and my father took a job managing my grandparents' restaurant. I remember being jealous that my cute, redheaded little brother Wayne was featured on the television commercials that my dad made for the restaurant. Wayne was chosen for stardom over me because I was not as cute as Wayne. In Billings, I have a memory of a singularly meaningful trip with my father fishing, just the two of us. I'm sure it was in response to a request from my mother to just get me out of the house and do something with me to get me out of her hair. I remember us camping outside in a field next to our vehicle beside a campfire. We looked up at the sky together, and my father pointed out the constellations, and together we spotted a satellite circling the Earth. At that time in the early 1960s, it was a rare thing. He told me how if we had the right kind of radio, we could listen to the satellite broadcasting as it passed above us. My mind went to the stars that night, and those dreams were only interrupted by the crickets and grasshoppers making noise in the open field. My dad calmed me down by telling me that we would be hunting those grasshoppers in the morning to help us catch fish. At the crack of dawn, we woke, and he handed me a small metal container, which he told me was for holding grasshoppers. It was about the size of an ashtray in a car, in an old car, I guess, and worked in a similar way. He showed me how to catch the grasshoppers by pinching my thumb and index finger against their backs and ever so carefully stuffing them into the box without letting the others out. I remember catching quite a few grasshoppers. However, I don't think I was very successful in getting any into the box without letting out one or more at the same time. When we walked down to the river where my father showed me how to impale a tobacco-spitting grasshopper on my hook, he told me I was an angler and he was a fly fisherman. At that point in my memory, he kept me a bit apart from him so I wouldn't be splashing in the river anywhere near where he would be fishing. I could see him down the river from me, whipping his line to some quiet spot below a large rock, while I would be casting out and reeling in my poor suffering grasshoppers. At no point during the day had I caught a single fish, while at the same time he had not only caught his limit, but started releasing the littlest ones in favor of the bigger ones. I'm sure I had bucked him endlessly and complained that my grasshoppers were incapable of catching fish. Then, at the end of the day, he set his line on the river and handed me the pole. Immediately, it was tugged by a fish, and together we reeled it in. Honestly, I've always wondered if that fish wasn't just handed over to me to make me feel good. But it is no matter. That day was one of the best days of my life. It was also one of the few days I ever had alone with my dad, all to myself. My father could be stern as a young parent, but he was always loving. He built us kids a log cabin in our backyard, and we promptly dug tunnels under it and created a big mud pit that we slipped and slid through. I remember our parents and grandparents filming us as we ran around that day covered in mud from our backyard pond. I recall a panic day when my dad and my grandfather blessed my little sister Liz after she had been run over by a garbage truck in the alley that ran behind her house. She was remarkably healed that day. One time, Dad took 2 sheets of particle board and put them on a table to make a ping pong table in our back basement. Later, that ping pong table was covered with a train set in that same basement room. I remember him kneeling down to explain to us, little children, that our brother James would not be coming to live with us. My mother had carried a child to full term, but James was stillborn, and Dad said that he would be waiting for us in heaven. That was a sad day, but not as sad as that felt by our family when my young brother Daniel drowned in our backyard fish pond in Danville, California. That was the single time I remember seeing my father shed tears of sadness and pain. Something I never saw before or since. My father loved to sing, and his loud and heartfelt rendition of Danny Boy at my brother Daniel's funeral was the greatest gift he had to give my little brother. Stephen Walker was a happy man. He loved life, and he loved meeting new people. He had a habit of greeting people that spoke in other languages in their native tongue. I don't know how many greetings he knew, but he would smile and loudly share them with anyone that made the mistake of saying they were from a different culture. The leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ have a habit that my father practiced his entire life. It is called ministering to the one. It is a way of making the person directly in front of you your sole focus. My father did that with everyone I ever saw talk with him. Christ shared that same habit when he talked to the woman at the well, when he spoke to Nicodemus, and privately with Paul. Christ sat down and spoke to a multitude of little children the same way, one by one. He did that in Israel, and then again in the New World the same way. Please remember my father, Stephen Walker, who we will see again, as a man that spoke directly to everyone he ever met, and did so as if he were their best friend or father. I pray for that memory of him in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Kahe Shoreshe, Malo Aleve, Ref, Rivet, Yatehe, Ola, Ni Hao, Shewadi, or Wadi. I'm working on that one. And as my brother said, that's the way my dad. Okay, try. I did so good this morning. He loved to greet people in their native language. I grew up with my father telling me Crow words that just sounded like a lot of gibberish to me. But I remembered Kahe, and I since have made some Crow friends through the Crow Indian tribal site on Facebook, and descendants of people that my father grew up with and worked with. And they're so excited to hear the stories of their ancestors that they didn't get to hear, but I did. And as my brother said, with those greetings, my dad would say to me, I do that and I have an instant friend. He asked that my brother and I talk about genealogy and also forgiveness. And I actually wrote down copious notes, but I could not decide what to say, because I knew my brother would say some wonderful things, which he did. I'm so grateful. But I want to tell you some of the things, life skills, and special things to me that my father taught me. Number one, he taught me to love God. He would often recite his conversion story, and I'm sure many of you have heard that. But it's special today because we'll be singing a song that was integral to that story, is that he after he married my mother. They were newlyweds, and she was a member of the church, and he was not. She got up to go to church in New Jersey, where he was stationed in the military. And she said, I'm going to church. And he said, well, wait, I'll go with you. And it took him a few minutes to dress, and so subsequently they were a little bit late. And he said, he had often recited to me that he can remember that day so vividly. He remembers the metal handrail that led to the door to the small chapel there. And as they were approaching the door, the congregation was singing, "Come, come, ye saints." And he said such a powerful feeling overcame him that he could feel the Spirit, and he knew in that moment that there was something special there, and that this was the place he would find the truth. And he indeed did. From that experience, he later learned about genealogy. And that story involved his mother, Agnes. They had gone to a large church meeting called a stake conference, where leaders from the church, what we call general authorities, would often be guest speakers. And at that particular meeting, there was a man named S. Dilworth Young. And as he was speaking, Agnes turned to my father and said, that man looks and talks and has the same mannerisms as my Uncle John Clausen. And that intrigued my dad. And so they stood in line after the meeting and met S. Dilworth Young, and my dad, as he always did, not shy, went up and shook his hand firmly and said, Elder Young, are you a Clausen? And S. Dilworth Young said, well, I've heard this story many times, can you tell? Well, my mother was a Clausen. And from that meeting, my dad set on a quest to find out how the Clausens in Utah were related to the Clausens in Montana. And it wasn't as easy as getting on the internet as it is today. It required writing letters and searching records. And every road he went down led to a dead end. But he continued his church search because my dad taught me, you know, when a challenge presents itself, you meet that challenge. And so he kept working on it 6 years. He tried to find that connection between the two Clausens, and he wasn't having any luck. But in the meantime, he started doing genealogy on other family lines. And he remembered as a small boy his father, Stephen Emerson Walker, reciting the poems of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And lo and behold, he was related to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. His maternal grandmother's mother's last name was Longfellow. And he was so excited. And so he researched that line, and he, as you all know, loved Wadsworth Longfellow so much and would read his poetry. And there are some very special poems that he read, especially to Jenny and me and my sister Elizabeth, that will always be dear to my heart. And so from that conversion to the church and that spark of genealogy, he also instilled in me a love for art and literature. And I remember, Steve, I bet you remember this, we had a game, card game called Authors. Okay, so I don't know if my mother instigated that or my dad did. I know my dad had something to do with it. It was a game, a little card game. Do you remember it, Wayne? Where you match the names of the authors with the books or poetry they wrote. And I remember I was in second grade. I had to be tested if I could attend a special class. And that I was in second grade. And the guy said, "Do you know who wrote Romeo and Juliet?" And I said, "It's on the tip of my tongue. William Shakespeare, I think." And he was amazed, but it was because of that game that we played with my dad, not because of any intelligence I had. But anyway, he loved the arts, he loved music, he played the violin, he played the clarinet. He learned the love of art and painting from his grandmother, Elizabeth Clausen. And when I was young, I loved to draw and do painting as well. And I remember he gave me a small palette box that had oil paints in it. And he had used it to paint a couple paintings. I have one of, and I think William has the other. And I came to find out later that that little art box, paint box, belonged to my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Clausen. And I do still have that picture, by the way. And so that was instilled in me. And I carry that through to my grandchildren too, is that it's so important to be curious about life, to have a love of learning. And forgive me, I'm going to tell another story. I'm looking at my brother and sister to see if they remember this. We were driving somewhere in Utah, and we looked out, and there was some kind of factory or something, and one of us said, "Dad, look at that, what is that?" He said, "Well, let's find out." And he turns down a dirt road, and there's signs that say, "No trespassing, no entrance." I said, Dad, look at the sign." "No, don't let us in." And we drove there, and he stepped out and he said, "I have all my kids in the car here, and they want to find out what this is." It was a gypsum processing plant where they made sheetrock. So I can tell you how they make sheetrock because we had a tour that day. And I remember going through a corn canning factory in Minnesota, same thing. "Oh, Dad, what's that?" So, I had to be careful. You couldn't say, "Dad, what's that?" Or for sure, he'd be taking you there to find out. I remember walking on the wharf in San Francisco, and there was a shell with some meat in it. And I said, "Dad, what is that?" He said, "Oh, that's abalone. You've got to try it now." You had to at least try any kind of food or anything at least once. And that's how my dad taught me to be curious and want to learn and know about everything. And I so appreciate these last few years that I've been able to actually reconnect with him. Because after my parents divorced, it wasn't, and I married and started a family, my dad and I had kids about the same age. And so we were busy with our lives that way. And so I would talk to him on the phone, and we'd come to visit occasionally. But these last couple of years that I have been able to come and do genealogy and hear more stories, and like my brother, try and pull out more stories from him that haven't been told before. I'm so grateful for that time, so grateful for that experience and the spiritual experiences that we were able to share. Special moments when we would discover new things that we didn't know about family, and meeting family members like the Clausens, and being able to have those conversations with them and finding out a different perspective of my grandparents. I loved these last little times with my dad. He loved music, and Steve is right. The only time I saw my dad cry was when my brother Daniel died. But these last 2 years, I saw him shed tears of joy and inspiration many times. If he heard a beautiful song, he would cry. If he recited a poem to me, he would cry. And I asked him many times to give me a father's blessing when he would come and visit him. And he would cry with me. I want to forgive me. Oh, here it is. You know, and I was trying to sum up my father in these past 2 days, and really just give you a feel for not only the man he was, but the man he became. A very precious time with him, with my sister and my sister Jenny. But Liz came down and we cut his hair together. It was such a tender moment. But I want to give you, I'm sorry, I'm kind of just winging this. I do, okay, gotta tell you one other thing before I read this poem. So, shortly before my dad passed, I had a conversation with him. And I said, Dad, I'm so jealous that you get to go and see your mom and your dad and your grandmother. I've learned to love those people through you. He shared their diaries and their stories with me, and I feel like I know them. And I said, Dad, say hello to them for me. And promise me you'll stay in touch with me. And he said, okay, if they let me. I said, I think they'll let you. Okay, he said. I said, just whisper in my ear. And since he's passed, I've had several times when he has whispered in my ear. And I feel him here now, I must tell you. But he said to me, and I started with all those greetings of hello, because what he said to me was, well, I think I know what my job is going to be. My job, when I get there, he said, you know, I think there's a lot of people wandering around in heaven that do not know they're dead. Because they did not believe in heaven, so they don't know where they are. And he said, I think my job is going to be to go greet those people and show them where they need to go. And I said, Dad, that sounds like a wonderful job to have. And he said, yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. But my oldest son, Neil, spent a lot of time with my father when he was going to BYU, after he had returned from his mission in Tonga in the South Pacific. And he had fallen in love with a girl there and was trying to get back so he could marry her. And my father, of course, knew a Tongan family. And so Neil would go up there because he loved the Tongan people, and my dad would say, come on, Neil, let's. And they spent a lot of time with that Tongan family. And from those stories, my daughter-in-law, Luisa Avioleta, and all of her family in Tonga loved my dad. And they had a beautiful memorial for him. And in that memorial, my grandson, one of my grandsons, Gordon Matile, wrote a poem, and I asked him to send that poem so that I could read it to you. I can get through it. Okay. My great-grandpa Steve, he spoke many different words. So much stories up his sleeve, hardly any left unheard. my great-grandpa Steve, the love he truly gave me